Yeah,
going to
the only
do,
thing
is
I'll
it?
say about that, Ian, I mean, it's a point well made, and ultimately, how can Huawei possibly defend itself if the very fact that it's Chinese
It
condemns it in the
can't.
eyes of these people? It
It
can't,
can't.
and we've
And
always sympathised with
and
Huawei on that. But one little point before you carry on. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. What we're saying, week 12, something like that, of the great lockdown of 2020. We're all still hanging in there. We've got the usual suspects all together, and what we're going to chat about this week, I think it's been quite an eventful week. We certainly had quite a lot of traction on our stories, both in terms of traffic and comments. So we're going to start off talking about Huawei's UK charm offensive, which went off at the start of this week. And I think both Jamie and Ian listened in on that, and both sites wrote it up. I think that's going to lead on to other stuff to do with China, because the Huawei UK charm offensive was precipitated by the usual pressure from the Americans for us to ban them and all that sort of thing, because America doesn't like China at the moment. So there's a few stories that fall under that umbrella. And then there's a third thing, which again has a slight sort of Chinese angle if you choose to look at it that way. But we're looking at facial recognition technology, and a couple of US companies have come out and made public statements on it. So we'll review that. And just to remind you that if you're watching this on Facebook or the site or YouTube, you can listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, etc. Right. Okay. So I'm sort of stitching a bunch of stories together. In fact, I'll give myself a breather. I think I might hand over to Jamie first. Jamie, why don't you tell us about Huawei's UK charm offensive?
Well, to be honest, my big takeaway from this actual sort of letter, which was sent out to the general public, was actually nothing to do with the content of the letter. So effectively, Huawei bought some full-page adverts where they turned around and they said, people of the UK, we're going to deliver the fastest, most reliable networks possible. And that's all it said was, basically a reaffirmation of how good their technology is, which is fine, if you're just doing normal advertising activities. But I think the unique situation that Huawei is in currently, with both external and internal pressure on Bojo to reconsider its positions in the UK, I think you've got to question whether it needs to do more to remove the high-risk vendor designation, which, have a little check. PSA, my mic is gone. The high-risk vendor label, which has been put on Huawei, 35% coming out of the supply chain review. If Bojo folds the pressure and that 35% limit is reduced to zero, so no UK telco can have any equipment from a high-risk vendor in its network, that completely screws Huawei, because it is a high-risk vendor currently. Everything it's done over the last 10 years, whether it's the Huawei Cybersecurity Center, whether it's opening up these innovation rooms where people can actually come in and look at the code and look at the products, all that got Huawei was a designation as a high-risk vendor. So it's got to do something new to remove the label of a high-risk vendor. Otherwise, it's going to be constantly under threat, and I'm pretty sure it'll be banned from the UK in a couple of years. Which is, nothing like that has been addressed by the Huawei team yet.
Is that your take on it, Ian? What do you make of it? You listened to it on the call, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I agree with Jamie on that. And I thought I did look at the letter and, listened to what they were saying on the call, which is sort of reiterating the points in the letter and then trying to make a few other points. I just felt it was a bit misjudged, really. They don't seem to do a very good job of this sort of thing. I don't think Huawei. I mean, the whole sort of rationale is quite flawed as well, because they made a big sort of point about saying they've been in the UK for 20 years. It's almost like we've been around for 2 decades. You can trust us. We've not done anything bad so far. The whole point that people like Tom Cotton, the US senator, who's sort of in the anti-Huawei camp, have been making recently, is that 5G is a very different thing from the technologies that have come before that Huawei's been serving until now. It takes it takes networks into all sorts of new areas, into very sort of sensitive areas. You're talking about an Internet of Things where you could have weapon systems potentially sort of using technology. You could have insulin drips, all sorts of things connected to 5G, and it's sort of economically, this is the argument we keep getting sold, that economically it's going to be a real game changer. So it's far, far more important than 4G and 3G. And Huawei's kind of sold that message itself as well. They've kind of gone around saying this is a radical new, transformational thing. And now so the logic's entirely flawed. You have to look at the two things differently. Just because they've been here for 20 years doing 4G and 3G isn't a reason to start thinking about them now. The other thing they were saying is this sort of, this point has been made several times about not being controlled by the Chinese government, which just isn't going to wash anymore at the moment, because whether or not they're privately owned or whether there's kind of some government involvement there, they're still a Chinese company, in the same way that Google, which is heavily restricted in China, is a US company. They're still a kind of Chinese technology champion. And what critics have kind of constantly gone on about the fact that they're subject to Chinese laws. So if the Chinese government comes along and says, you have to do this, you have to do that, they have to comply with it. And all the founders have been able to say in response to that is, I'd rather shut down my business than go along with those demands. Well, that's not going to reassure any. That's not going to. Well, whatever. It's not going to reassure operators that are using Huawei equipment. If that's what he's going to do.
Yeah, the only thing I'll say about that, Ian. I mean, it's a point well made, and ultimately, how can Huawei possibly defend itself if the very fact that it's Chinese condemns it in the eyes of these people? It can't. And we've always sympathised with Huawei on that. But one little point before you carry on, Ian. It is a bit selective, because there are plenty of other dodgy authoritarian countries, and we do business with their companies.
But they're not economic superpowers.
There we go. So that's the only point I want to make. There's a degree of pragmatism.
I'm not saying that I defend the line against them. I'm just saying that's what they're facing. And the other thing that they came up on the call with is this sort of reference to these, and this gets us into the sort of costs issue, which Jamie and you've been writing about this week. You've been writing about, Scott. There's the rip-out costs. Referring to these reports by independent analysts. Citing the costs. The trouble is, these reports were sort of commissioned by Huawei, so this, I'm not sort of trying to disparage the firms that did them or the research itself, and it doesn't invalidate the findings, but they carry a lot more weight if they'd actually come from a sort of independent source, and it wasn't something that, one of them was actually commissioned specifically by Huawei, one of the ones it referred to, and the other one came from Mobile UK. Well, Mobile UK is like a UK lobby group that represents the 4 network operators. The 3 of those are sort of heavily, reliant on Huawei for equipment. So these are the guys that have been running around saying, we don't want you to ban Huawei because it'll cost us loads of money and delay 5G rollout. And that's perfectly understandable they would say that, because it kind of screw their business in the short term. But it's not a sort of, to say it's an independent voice is kind of a bit misleading.
Yeah, and you allude to the stuff I wrote the other day about Vodafone, which we were just chatting about before recording the podcast. This is nothing new from Vodafone. It's just kind of been re-reported, and for some reason it's really caught everyone's attention. And that was the UK CTO chap called Scott Petty basically going, look, it's not just going to cost us a lot of time and hassle, but it's going to set back the whole cause of UK 5G if we do this.
Which is a completely valid thing to say as well.
No, actually. I agree. I'm not pushing back on that. I think the way he was quoted in the FT piece, which I re-reported, he made it sound a little bit binary, as if to say, almost no Huawei, no 5G. I know that's not what he's saying, but the way, and I don't know how accurately his words are reported by the FT, but that was just what I took from it. It came over a bit binary, and it came over that perhaps Vodafone was being a little bit too emphatic in defending Huawei than might be expedient right now, that's all. But I completely agree with you, Jamie. The underlying point is completely correct. Anyway, so so loads of people commented on that. Interestingly, in the comments on Telecoms.com, it's completely degenerated into a referendum on the merits of China as a country. So maybe that explains why it got so many reads, even though this report wasn't necessarily saying anything new. Sorry, Jamie, were you going to say something further on that?
No. I mean, the thing is, this Huawei, the Vodafone comments are completely valid, and they're completely understandable, and I can see where he's coming from. But I mean, it's nothing new. BT have come out and said, yes, it's going to cost us a lot of money. Vodafone has said it. I mean, everyone knows that ripping a network apart and then replacing it is going to cost money. It's just, I don't fully understand why they've been saying this has got so much attention now. But I mean, this goes back to the original point which I was making. It kind of, everyone's walking a tightrope at the moment, whether it's Vodafone, 3 and BT, because they've got Huawei in their network. O2 have got like 6 base stations that come from Huawei or something like that, thanks to trials from a couple of years ago. But Huawei will always be a risk to have in the network because it's been designated high-risk vendor. Now, Ian Duncan Smith and US politicians are trying to pressurize the UK government to remove all high-risk vendors from the network. So I guess the question is, can Huawei do anything to eliminate risk, or can Huawei do anything about being Chinese?
Certainly not the latter.
That's what it comes down to. Well, maybe, Broadcom relocated its business from Singapore to the US. It's registered in Delaware now. It could technically, take its business outside of China because apparently it is a private company. So
or maybe they could just set up an affiliate. They go, okay, this is Huawei US. It's totally transparent. It's run like a public company. All the accounts, all the headcount, everything's transparent, and and there's no dotted line to Huawei in China. They just share a brand. I don't know how plausible that is.
I can't see that working.
I don't think that would satisfy anyone.
I mean, they had this thing a year ago, didn't they, when they suggested, and it seems to have died now, this plan to clone, a lot of the IP and then flog it to another company, which was a really curious sort of scheme that got, I think, the Economist got.
They were talking about a licensing deal, weren't they?
It was a licensing deal, yeah. They sort of take their whole sort of 5G business and clone it, and then sell it to another company gets all the kind of know-how to set up a kind of duplicate business, and it's sort of licensed back to Huawei. And I think even that would, US guys would have looked at that and thought, what's going on here? This is all a bit suspicious. So I think setting up another affiliate and it's just not going to work. But
I agree, it's a rubbish idea, and I profoundly regret even bringing it up.
But I think, Jamie, the suggestion of moving the company is not a stupid thing to suggest, because as you say, it's already happened with Broadcom. The only thing there is, it's a Chinese tech champion. What's the Chinese government going to think about that, and about losing this kind of extremely valuable company that's building its 5G networks, which is supposedly the most important thing since the invention of the wheel? It's bound to cause problems at home, I think, if they were to try and do something like that. And that's why all this stuff about we're not really, we're not linked to the government, is they sort of undermine their case sometimes, because whenever they get particularly worked up by Trump, they always say something like, oh, the Chinese government isn't going to let us get slaughtered on the chopping board, or they're going to take some actions
one that you've got no connection to.
Yeah, the one that they're completely distanced from is going to do things like that. So, and of course, the US would do the same thing if someone was doing something against Cisco or Google.
Yeah,
but they're privately owned. But that's just the way the kind of world works. It is a Chinese technology champion. So.
Well, and increasingly more so. We'll get onto that when we finish this sort of Huawei UK segment, because protectionism and public sector investment in the private sector is just going to be a growing thing as part of the balkanization that we spoke about last week.
I guess one thing you've got to ask before we move on there is what are the business priorities of Huawei? because you have to weigh up the pros and the cons of the international market versus the Chinese market. So theoretically, if Huawei is as we should take as the original standing point until we're proven wrong, a private company, it should be able to locate its headquarters anywhere in the world. But then it becomes a bit of a complicated problem because, assuming Huawei does want to do this, and that's enough to satisfy the cautious politicians, it then becomes an international corporation trying to go into China. So, and the way Chinese regulations work, that international companies have to be partnered with a domestic firm to start doing business in China. But then you also have the unwritten rule that Chinese companies favor Chinese companies. So even if you are taking Huawei out of China so it can secure more contracts in the international market, you then got to question, well, actually, is it worth it considering how big the Chinese market is alone for 5G? There was some estimates today. So I was going through some Omdia research earlier. Omdia is like our sister company, our sister research company. And it effectively said that there's going to be 300,000 base stations deployed in China by the end of 2020, 5G base stations. Now, just as a point of comparison, Ofcom, the UK regulator, estimates that there's total 40,000 towers in the UK. Now, that doesn't mean that there's 40,000 base stations. There's obviously going to be more than that, but that's 40,000 physical towers out and around the UK. Now, there's going to be 7 times more base stations deployed this year before they've even got to 100% coverage than we've actually got towers. That sort of like demonstrates how much of a business opportunity being a RAN player in China actually is.
Yeah.
So why would you come out of that market and compromise your potential to earn money when, like Ian, your quote is what? China's going to account for 60% of the 5G market.
Yeah, that was a figure cited on an earnings call by Boyacom, actually, that he that's his estimate of how much of the 4G market it's responsible for, and he said, I see no reason why it'd be any different in 5G. So yeah, it's
while we're mentioning that, that's a good time to bring up the story about Ericsson in China, just as a little aside. But they recently announced that they were writing down a ton of kit or inventory or whatever they call it in China as a consequence of them winning that work with the 3 big Chinese MNOs that we've all reported on previously. And my angle, and I'll ask you for your angle in a sec, Ian, my angle on it was, it's interesting that they're having to announce this massive write-down because presumably they had accounted for a certain value of that kit. And then at some stage, they'd had to devalue it, which to me implies that they kind of dropped their pants on prices in order to get involved in the market. But, Ian, it's not like they hadn't announced in advance that sort of thing was going to happen. So what's your view on that particular move?
Yeah, there's probably some I think it's not horrendous, is it? It's about 100 million. Am I right in thinking the write down? So it's something not like they've written it down by $1 billion or something. But it's
chunk of change, mate.
Yeah, in the context of what Ericsson makes in annual revenues and profits, 100 million is not. It's a $25 billion company. Yeah, so
fair enough.
It's not it's not insignificant. You don't really want to write anything down. So yeah, there has possibly been some discounting and. I talked to them before about, because it's not just China they're doing this. They're trying to build market share everywhere and being quite aggressive, I think, on what they're offering to companies. So they did this in Norway, which has been using Huawei equipment and has obviously now decided that that's not a sensible thing to be doing in the current circumstances. And there's been some pressure on the operators, I'm guessing, but they've gone for an Ericsson sort of, whole network, and that involves swapping out Huawei kit, which they've agreed to do as part of the kind of contract and to get it done quite quickly. So their head of networks, Frederick Yedling, was saying there's some kind of costs in there, and therefore we take a margin hit when we win jobs like that, but it pays off in the long run strategically.
Yeah.
You make the money back later on. And that's pretty much what they've they're saying about China, that their second quarter is going to be a little bit difficult and there's a kind of an impact there. But then later on in the year, it'll kind of turn around. And, as Jamie's saying, it's a huge amount of work. They've only got a fairly small share of the work. They're about, I think, 11.5% of the China mobile tender, and then it's not really known what they've picked up with the other operators.
But it's assumed it's a similar amount, isn't it?
Maybe it's a similar amount. I mean, they're quite happy about what they've done because they've never had a very big market share there. They've only ever had about 10%, so it's actually a slight increase. And if the operators there are spending massive amounts of money, and we're hearing at the moment that China's rollout is really pretty much what's kind of buoying the 5G market this year, and why things might be a little bit better than expected given the slowdown that's happening in Europe and potentially, could happen in North America if the pandemic sort of continues to worsen there and they have to sort of introduce some restrictions. But it's, I think it's, they've been pretty transparent about it all along. And the thing is that they're, I'm not trying to blow Ericsson's trumpet or anything. They have done a pretty good job under the current CEO of turning things around. You look at the margin development and they're in a much healthier place than they were. They're quite healthy sort of gross and operating margins at the networks business now. So even when they've been warning in previous quarters about margin pressure, they've done well, and they reckon they can offset a lot of the pain with investments they've made in automation. A lot of the research and development commitments they've had. This is the other thing is that one of the reasons I think they've done pretty well against Nokia recently is this decision Nokia made to use these, I always get the acronym wrong, but these programmable components, which sort of give you some flexibility, but they're quite expensive.
Oh, is that FPGA?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Rather than using sort of more application specific stuff, which Ericsson and Huawei went with.
And, so it's chips that you can fundamentally redesign on the fly. Yeah.
And they obviously thought they'd get some advantage out of that, but last October we're forced to admit that it was like a big mistake because it's basically made their products not as competitive. Their margins have really suffered.
They're more expensive FPGA.
They're more expensive, so they can't go in. That means is they can't go into a contract and say match Ericsson on pricing feasibly without taking a margin hit. And their margins are not very good at Nokia at the moment. They're not. I think they're barely profitable. They might even only just be break even. They're trying to change, and they're trying to turn this around. But it's going to take them 2.5 years to get all those FPGA chips out of the out of the system, basically. So that's kind of worked quite well for Ericsson in terms of this kind of land grab that they're on at the moment. And if they can carry on building market share, take a bit of a short-term hit on margins, but it pays off in the long run, then it's quite a sensible strategy. So I don't think anybody would be panicking about what they've said about the second quarter thing.
Yeah, I'm certainly not suggesting anyone should panic. My take was just, are there some unique circumstances if you're a non-Chinese company doing business in China where you're expected to make some extra concessions on margin? But as you say, and I did nod to this in my piece, these three operators have got by far the most buying power out of any of Ericsson's customers. So of course they can strike a hard bargain. So it could just be as simple as that. I was just asking the question.
Well, also, you're probably right about them having to be generous in China because it's a difficult market to operate in. We all know there's a lot of favoritism for the big sort of Chinese guys, and those big Chinese guys are seen to be extremely price competitive themselves. So you go into a market like that, they're obviously, it's going to be much harder for them than it is operating somewhere like the US, where they probably make most of their profits, I'm guessing, because they can charge a lot more. There's fewer competitors around. It's just totally different circumstances. So yeah, you're probably right, but I don't think it's a strategy that is a totally stupid one. And I think the hit was sort of expected. They were sort of warning about it for a while. So
totally. Yeah. So I'm going to move on more generally to China. The Huawei story we started off with is sort of influenced by this, and I guess that the angle I was proposing on the Ericsson one was to do with protectionism. And, we've spoken about this loads of times and we'll continue to do so because it is the overarching sort of mega trend that's kind of defining this industry globally right now. But the Americans seem to every week just ramp up the amount of pressure they're putting on us to do with Huawei and to do with China in general. And to open up discussion of this bit, Jamie, I'm just going to ask you about the story you wrote to do with an American. Is it just the Secretary of State? I can't remember exactly what it was. Pompeo. He lent on us quite heavily earlier on this week. Why don't you tell us a bit about
that? No, he just effectively said to China, sort of stop picking on the UK. Right. He just decided that China was bullying the UK, and that the US should step in and defend it. Basically, he's been pushing. He's pointing towards a conference which took place where the CEO of like the Asia business of HSBC has signed some sort of memorandum or understanding or some sort of declaration to say that everything in Hong Kong is fine, effectively.
Right.
And they basically turned around and said, yeah, like, you know, the British government shouldn't allow the Chinese government to pressurize it through pressurizing one of its big banks. It's adding a lot of unconnected things. It's proper tin hats conspiracy stuff. It's believable that this sort of thing happens, but you know, it's not the official line. And I seriously doubt anyone in the UK has turned around and gone to the US. Oh, can you just fight this battle for us? I've spoken about this numerous times, and I think it's what we're heading towards now is the creation of two separate ecosystems. One which is controlled by China, and one which is controlled by the US, where you've got effectively two different supplier pools supplying two different customer bases, and you know, because of regulations, because of conflicts, never shall those two overlap. So at some point, you know, some companies can have to turn around and go, you know, I pick China, I pick the US.
Totally. Everyone's being asked to pick a team, aren't they?
Yeah. I mean, I think that is absolute worst case scenario. Don't get me wrong, worst case scenario. But the way the world is spiraling at the moment, I think that this trade war could be, you've spoken about it before, Scott, the new Cold War. I think it could be a new economic Cold War, and you will have an iron curtain come down, and it will create two separate economic ecosystems. The other thing, but the other element which I think adds to this fight is one company which has turned around and said, you know, to counter Chinese state-sponsored R&D in the US, we should do state-sponsored R&D. Yeah. And all that does, you know, the argument is that if you have a state-sponsored R&D program in the US, it's wealth creation and wealth concentration in China. So why not combat it with doing that in the US? And that all sounds very well and good, but it only serves the interests of the US. It just makes a second concentration of wealth over there and screws over everyone else in the world, allied nations, may I add, as well, because you're removing wealth creation and R&D investment opportunities in other markets. So, you know,
I think the phrase. Sorry, go on.
So I was going to say the phrase that I used in this, with this whole sort of developing conundrum is a Gandhi phrase. You know, an eye for an eye makes the world go blind. Right. That's exactly what's developing now. An escalating conflict, which is hurting everyone and paying zero attention to the law of unintended consequences. So every time you throw up, every time the US does something, this is throwing a pebble into the economic pond. And all China and the US and the White House and Beijing, all they're doing is paying attention to this original splash in the middle of the economic pond. Now, they're not paying attention to the ripples that are spreading out to everywhere else. And, you know, ripples gather momentum, they can turn into waves and they can turn into tsunamis and they can destroy countries. And that's potentially what can happen to, you know, segments of an economy somewhere else. You know, the Taiwanese have a semiconductor industry, but if you've got these state-sponsored wealth creation centers in China and in the US, all of a sudden this is unfair competition. You've got innovation being falsely inflated in these two areas, and then the one that are trying to play fair in Taiwan gets completely wiped out. So it's
And
completely
TSMC is
destroyed the
being asked to pick a team,
ecosystem.
isn't it?
So I just think there's so much that isn't considered.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I really like your ripple in the water extended metaphor there. That was good. And may I also say, it's nice to see you with your glasses off. We don't see that very often.
They were hurting my nose a little bit, so I just had to take them off.
We should, Ian, we should do all of us glasses off podcast one day and just do everyone's head in. One other thing about your point, Jamie, is I think this eye for an eye thing is such a moral slippery slope. So the US and the West condemns China for being protectionist, condemns China for not playing by trade rules. And then you just go, right, well, if you can do it, then we can too. So, I mean, either it's wrong or it's not. So,
well, they're basically saying you're not allowed to do this because you're Chinese. And I see that's effectively. I mean, the ultimate reason is they're saying you're a communist dictatorship, but they don't want to say that out in public. But they're basically said that is the underlying reason, and they don't want a communist state to become a superpower and overtake the US. So they're trying to everything they can so the US can remain as the foremost economic superpower in the world. But it is turned around and said, well, we can do this because we're a democratic state, and I use the term democratic in the same sentence as the US very loosely.
Well, actually, I'm going to come on to that. There's another little ancillary story that feeds that.
I severely disagree with everything that's going on in American politics. I think at the moment it's one of the most distasteful. No, it's one of the most distasteful countries in the world, and I just can't get my head around it. Why can't everyone just be level-headed and middle-grounded? Like Europeans?
Yes, well, indeed.
But it's that they're just saying you can't do this, but we can.
Yes. So that in the area of protectionism, and I'm going to give you a chance to speak in a sec, Ian, don't worry. He's been very patient. So there's a few things. So, I mean, the company, you haven't named them, but you're alluding to some comments from the CEO of Parallel Wireless, I think, earlier, who seems to have very much picked a team. And another couple who haven't picked a team. They haven't been as sort of publicly sort of pugnacious as the Parallel guy has. But, you know, at the center of this geopolitical tussle, and why we talk about it so much on the Telecoms.com podcast, is that 5G has been put at the center of it. Ian framed it excellently earlier about all the super duper things 5G is supposed to be able to do. You stop short of saying Skynet, but I'm going to say it. Basically, people are viewing 5G as Skynet, and they're saying we don't want our enemies or our bitter rivals' technology in Skynet in case they tell it to send the Terminators onto us. So, so then we've got this sort of preoccupation that the US state seems to have right now with Open RAN that we've spoken about plenty of times. And they're obviously serious about it because I think that's what emboldens people like the Parallel guy to speak up. And then just today, although the story broke yesterday, I was just late to cover it, we had Mavenir and Altiostar forming a partnership over Open RAN. And one of the things I pointed out in my piece, and then I'll ask you, I know you didn't necessarily write it up, Ian, but presumably you're aware of it in the broad context. One of the things I pointed out is Mavenir and Altiostar, I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Ian, are a very similar space. And under different circumstances, you'd expect them to be directly competitive with each other. But now all of a sudden, they're sort of getting all pally. And my take on it was there's probably a ton of American public money going around for anyone who can put half an effort into Open RAN. So that's where they're going. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I didn't write a separate story on it. I did sort of acknowledge it in something else I wrote about Huawei in the UK, which is to do with HPE actually putting pressure on Johnson as well over.
Oh, you can mention that. Yeah, they wrote a letter, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, HPE is another interesting one because they sort of develop servers for the base stations, and they sort of see a role in this. They're also getting into the core network market, but they kind of see a role in this Open RAN community as well, clearly. And the letter they wrote was very much, you don't have to worry about keeping risky vendors in the network anymore because, hey, everything's becoming more open, and that's the alternative, which is the whole of sort of Open RAN argument. I I think it's a really interesting technology, and it's risen up the agenda very fast, and there's some companies doing interesting things with it, but it's still got a lot of challenges to overcome, clearly, before it's something that you'd see used in a mass market sense in a developed market. And the other thing I don't really like about it, and this gets to what you guys have just been talking about, is the sort of politicization of it. It didn't start out that way. It came along in 2018 very much as a sort of answer to a lack of competition in the market, without geopolitics being a factor. And it was actually formed from two groups, one of them Chinese, one of them sort of heavily sort of US. And there's a lot of Chinese companies. This is the odd thing about it. There's a lot of Chinese companies in the specifications part of it. Yeah, there's a lot of Chinese companies in the specifications group itself, the ORAN Alliance, including ZTE, which claims to be pretty active there. So there's a real conundrum anyway, I think, with Open RAN. But I don't really like the kind of, it's good in a way that it's this sort of open idea that you can mix and match vendors in a RAN. You can sort of have more competition in there. You can break open some of these interfaces that stop you from doing that. All sounds very good, and it kind of gets presented as in this sort of open source way. In that sense, it's sort of it all sounds very kind of democratic, and it sounds like a sort of pro competition thing. But I don't like the sort of US slant on it, which is increasingly to sort of position it and US Open RAN companies as the next big thing. And as you're saying, this whole I think there's been suggestions earlier in the year about setting up a big fund, $1 billion fund, to kind of pump money into this area. And you've got you've got these two companies together now, which are competitors. You're right, Scott. They're pretty much in the same area, kind of joining forces. It's almost like a sort of movement. It comes after other weird things in the same space. We were talking about this, I think, on the last pod, with the UK kind of talking to vendors, specific vendors, about participating in 5G rollout. Companies like NEC and Samsung, and it's almost like they're trying to pick winners rather than allowing the market to decide. Which is how things have worked over the last 20 years, longer than that. In telecom, it's the private sector and the market has decided, and now we're sort of increasing this situation where countries pick winners and pump money into specific areas. And as Jamie was saying before, it's going to have a ripple effect that can affect whole national economies, and it forces people into specific choices. It forces people down roads they wouldn't have taken before, and ultimately it's probably just going to be quite a damaging thing. So I like lots of things about Open RAN. I don't like the sort of political hijacking of it that seems to have happened, and I think that's kind of unfortunate that's come about. And I suspect some of the guys in the ecosystem, some of the operators themselves, don't like the fact that that's happened. When they were talking about this in 2018, it was never positioned this way. I remember talking to Deutsche Telekom at the time, and it was very much about just getting more competition into the network and having other options for innovation. Yeah. Now it's about getting rid of Huawei.
Yeah, it is.
So I got some.
Go on, Jamie.
I got some interesting stats that to go right back to the beginning. And first of all, I'd say I completely agree with everything Ian said there. I think as soon as you've got non-technologists making technology decisions, the industry is in a very, very, very bad position. And that's exactly what is going on at the moment. You've got politicians, the supply chain review. Although they haven't done any material damage aside from Three's network deployment plans, you had politicians seeking advice and probably partisan advice as well, on how to make technology decisions. That's a very bad way to go. Looking at, I'm just going to have to quickly run the numbers myself because I haven't actually got it put as percentages in front of me. I ran a poll on when Open RAN will be. So the question was, when will Open RAN be ready to be embraced by the industry without reservation? So this is going back to what Ian was saying about it just not being market ready at the moment. So 16% of people said it never will, and 36% of people said 2023 or beyond, and then the rest, only about 15% said now or 2021. I realised I put 2022 down as two options here. And that collected 25% of the vote. So what you're looking at is about 70% of people don't think that Open RAN is going to be ready, or more than 70% of people until 2022, and 15% of people don't think that we'll ever be ready or market resilient enough, which is, I thought there's some quite interesting numbers there.
Yeah, especially as these are Telecoms.com readers. It's not just like you're asking random punters. These are all people who should know what they're talking about. I think, and I note, Jamie, I'm not necessarily asking you to speak about it, but I just thought I'd flag it up as I was going through our stories this week that you'd also reported on the US looking at chucking 25 billion at the chip sector. Again, just yet another example of this sort of state picking a winner, this sort of protectionism, all this stuff that we've criticized that the Chinese are doing. We're all just getting involved. And, while it's morally dodgy, pragmatically, they've got a point. If their view is that the Chinese aren't going to stop subsidizing their own internal champions, then you've got a choice of playing the martyr or countering, haven't you? I do have some sympathy.
The problem with that is that it offers no opportunity for genuine innovation.
Yeah, or resolution of the problem either.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, because I guess I'll tell you a good example. Right, if you've got £100,000 and you turn it into £110,000, that's generally considered good business. If you've got £100 million and you turn it into £110 million, that's generally accepted as the way the world works. The rich get richer, whereas the poor have to work hard to get richer, and that's all this sort of state-sponsored R&D is going to create. It's going to create innovation purely because a company is in a wealthy nation which has funds directed towards it and a lot of money directed towards it, rather than actually innovation created because you've got an innovative company and idea. You can get to a position of genuinely good products, but what you're more likely to have is mediocre products pushed through at a highly efficient level. Supply chain experts coming through and making products really cheap, as opposed to genuine innovation pushing it forward. So you'll have a mediocre product which is a lot cheaper, therefore is a lot more efficient for the industry, as opposed to super efficiency growing through genuine competition. And that's a very philosophical way to look at it.
Yeah, well, and it's getting like that these days. Just a couple of other things I want to mention before we move on to the last segment. That this stuff sort of spilling over into the digital and the app economy a fair bit as well. So I've written a couple of stories. One I just wrote was the last story I wrote today. Twitter's banned thousands of Twitter accounts linked to the Chinese state. It's dug up over 20,000 Twitter accounts, which it reckons it can prove were put there by Chinese state actors designed to sort of spread Chinese state propaganda. Not, I must stress, necessarily to meddle in US elections, although that's bound to come up sooner or later as we get closer to the November general election in the US. A lot of the ones in the Twitter post they said are related to spreading propaganda about Hong Kong, which is obviously a big thing for China at the moment. They're making some quite strong moves towards fully incorporating Hong Kong into the Chinese country and to have it beholden to Chinese law, which is obviously alarming the hell out of a lot of Hong Kong people because the Chinese have a habit of, for example, not being very accommodating to dissenting journalists and that sort of thing. So Twitter's banned that. There was another thing to do with TikTok. Let me just remind me of that one.
Privacy review from the European Data Protection Supervisor.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, there was that. And then at the same time, it was Zoom. I sort of squeezed them both into the same story. Zoom had suspended, this is again to do with Hong Kong, had suspended some US-based accounts that were doing things like celebrating the anniversary of Tiananmen Square and all that sort of thing. And the strong impression is that they did so because they came under pressure from China. So I guess the reason I'm flagging these things up is just to show that it's affecting everything, the digital economy, the app economy, everything's globalized. And now you're getting to a stage where US Zoom accounts are being taken down because they've broken Chinese law. So that all gets a bit vague and a bit confusing. So anyway, this stuff's going to keep going on, but as I promised, we need to move on for that. Although it's a sort of, there is a bit of a segue built into that when we're talking about a digital economy, because another growing aspect of the digital economy is facial recognition. So, to bring it back to telecoms, oh look, the dog's come home. Facial recognition is already used for things like unlocking smartphones and all that sort of thing. There've been stories I've written a few times in the past, again in China, where there's these stories about this thing called social credit there, which relies quite a lot on facial recognition, which is a way of digitally tracking individual citizens and rewarding them for behavior that the state condones and punishing them for behavior that the state disapproves of, which is all very dystopian and scary. And a lot of that relies on facial recognition. And Jamie, you wrote about a couple of US companies this week that made a sort of public stance on facial recognition technology. So I'll shut up and let you tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, one I really agree with, and the other I'm heavily critical of. Now, so basically, you have IBM and Amazon have both turned around and said, we will stop selling facial recognition technologies because the world can't be trusted with them. Now, well, actually, Microsoft, I haven't looked into it extensively, but Microsoft have also actually done this as well. So the two which I think are doing a good job are Microsoft and IBM. Microsoft and IBM. IBM has said explicitly, we will no longer sell facial recognition technologies. Now, that's an indefinite commitment. Microsoft also turned around and said, we will not sell facial recognition technologies until there is federal legislation to govern the use of it in police forces. Now, Amazon, now this is the one I do not agree with, because I think it's corporate opportunism. They effectively turned around and said, we think that Congress and Senate, the House and the Senate, are going to start developing some laws. So we're not going to sell facial recognition for 12 months, but we're going to uphold some of these contracts that we already have in place. Now, there's so many things wrong with this statement that I just don't even know where to start. I mean, firstly, it's a 12-month commitment. There's absolutely no guarantee that Congress can actually force through any legislation in 12 months. It takes a lot longer, and it's a lot more complex than that. Second, building on that point, Amazon haven't said that in 12 months' time what would happen if there's no law. Would this standoff be continued, or will they just go back to business as usual? The other thing is they haven't told us which contracts are going to be honoured and which contracts are going to be closed off. So they're supposed to be protecting us from implementation in sort of like border forces and intelligence agencies and police forces, but they cannot confirm and refuse to confirm to anyone whether the existing partnerships in place with like ICE, which is the immigration, the southern border, the border control for the US. I can't remember what the acronym is.
Yeah, I think it is ICE. That rings a bell.
ICE, it is ICE, but it's like immigration something.
I can't remember what the acronym.
I can't remember what it is. But they haven't actually said whether they'd suspend that contract or not, or suspend their contracts with any police forces, or suspend the partnerships between Ring, the smart doorbell. It shares data with certain police forces. They've not said whether they'd suspend that contract either. They've also refused to pay any attention to, like in the statement, it turns around and says, we've been campaigning for legislation for this for years. And it's like, well, first of all, I haven't heard Amazon kick up a fuss about it. Pretty quiet campaign. Once. Yeah, they haven't made a fuss about it once. Microsoft has. They've been kicking up all sorts of trees because of this. But that didn't stop them from selling the software to organizations without any accountability or transparency. So, the Amazon morals are here, but if your check is up here, the Amazon sales guy will forget about it. There's just so many holes in this commitment. It just seems like such shallow, paper-thin corporate opportunism to capitalize on a society which is really angry with the police force at the moment. So, Amazon seems to be kicking the police force in hope that it gets some good PR from the general public.
Sounds possible. And for the sake of framing, I mean, it should be obvious it's all over the news, but we should stress that the reason the police force is such a focus is that this unlawful killing of a guy in the States by a policeman has metastasized into just all kinds of stuff all over the world. I mean, in the UK, I'll stress, I don't think a single person thinks that this is anything other than murder and should be punished accordingly. But it's metastasized into all sorts of things in the UK. We've got people tearing down statues. We've got random 70s comedies getting taken off because they might upset the sensibilities. And one upshot of all of this is that corporates, well, everyone, but corporates especially, are or feel under a lot of pressure to make some kind of stance, some kind of symbolic gesture, some kind of statement. And that sounds to me like the sort of thing that Amazon was doing there. Whereas, as you rightly say, Jamie, when someone like IBM goes, right, we're just canning it. This is too dodgy. It's too hot to handle. We're putting it on the back burner until society's found a way of using this stuff properly. That's a much more substantial position.
The thing is, I completely agree with the end results. Like, I don't believe facial recognition technology should be in the wild at the moment. We talk about the 5 nines of reliability in tech all the time, and that's a technology, a software, a piece of hardware, whatever it is reliable 99.999% of the time. The 5 nines of reliability. There is absolutely no facial recognition software in the world that you could say meets that litmus test. So why is something which has the potential to compromise privacy rights so extremely, but also be abused in such an obvious and sort of like cloaked fashion? Why is that allowed to be solved? So I agree that legislation should be put forward before any facial recognition. And if that means removing the iris scanner, fair. I'd take that off. My big issue is that I like what IBM and Microsoft are doing, because they're saying we're going to stop this until this point. They're not saying we're going to stop this, wait for the heat to die down, and then start selling it again. We're saying we're stopping this until these demands are met, and that is a good moral position to take. Amazon is not taking that. It's corporate opportunism. They should be called out for it. They should be punished. Well, not punished for it, but called out for it, because they're not exactly a good company. Bezos is a pretty despicable person when you look at the reports on Amazon. That
sounds like another podcast.
Yeah, I know. I mean, there's no smoke without fire.
Well, one thing that does occur to me, actually, since
you
flagged it up, he's a knob.
Yeah, basically, he's a knob.
In summary. Sorry, Ian, I will let you talk in a second. I just got...
That's the only thing I've got to contribute, really, is that he's a knob.
Really?
Because I wasn't even aware. It's an interesting issue. But,
I'll still ask you to expand on his knobbishness in a sec. But one thing that occurs to me, Jamie, you brought up Ring, and it just suddenly occurred to me, the privacy implications of that. You've got a camera. Anyone who comes around your house is getting filmed, and that footage is going to the cloud, whether they like it or not. I mean, that by itself feels like a bit of an privacy intrusion. But then I guess we've had CCTV flying around for decades, and we've all just learnt to put up with that. But anyway, just a thought of another slightly dodgy thing out there. What are you going to say, Jamie?
Yeah, but it just... there's a reason Ring has taken off in the US and it's not taken off in Europe. And that's because in Europe, we hold privacy to a different standard than anywhere else in the world. Privacy rights are much more stringent in Europe than they are over in Europe or in certain parts of Asia. Certain parts of Asia, they do have strong privacy rights. And some people may say, well, no, you're talking absolute rubbish there. But I'll turn around and say, well, there is a reason Safe Harbor existed before it got taken down, and there is a reason once that was found to be inadequate, Privacy Shield was created and still exists today. And on top of that, you have EU GDPR rules, which are applicable to every country in the world who wants to do business in Europe. All of these things maintain European privacy elsewhere for European citizens. Obviously, it can't put it on US citizens. That says to me that regulatory powers and legislative privacy rights in the UK are higher in Europe, are higher here than elsewhere. And that's the reason why Amazon can get away with these Ring partnerships in North America, and why they'd never be able to get away with them in Europe.
Okay. All right. So, Ian, just to finish off, because I'm pretty sure we've done about an hour, you're about to use the Telecoms.com platform to slander the richest man in the world who could sue us into oblivion with the money he finds down the back of the sofa. What precisely do you want to say on the matter?
From calling him a knob? I don't think that's going to worry him.
No,
I think he's been called far worse.
But joking aside, what's he done to give you a low opinion of him?
I don't think he. I think he's. A lot of the stuff that Jamie was talking about, I think there are sort of multiple things that Amazon it doesn't come out of very well recently, and in issues like censorship as well, and a rush to sort of remove things from its platform. If it's increased. It's a very worrying organisation anyway, I think, because it increasingly sort of looks like a monopoly in particular markets. And one thing that I'm scared of with this particular, the circumstances we're in at the moment in the world with the pandemic and the kind of shift to digital platforms and the shift to online shopping and e-commerce and things like that, is that it could make a company like that even more. Even more monopolistic, I guess, in certain sectors. And when you see them doing some of the things that Jamie's just been talking about doing, it's not the kind of organisation that you really want anywhere. You don't want it in that kind of role at all. So, it's worrying times, I think, when you've got that sort of thing going on.
Yeah, and involved everything. They're sending people to the moon and stuff. The space station, isn't it?
I don't know him, to be honest with you. I've never interviewed him, probably never will, and so I don't really know what he's like. He's not seen to be particularly philanthropic, should we say, is he? As billionaires go, and as kind of people in that position go, and there's a lot of kind of bad press about Bill Gates, isn't there, at the moment, to do with his sort of philanthropic activities in the past, trying to sort of. Yeah, whereas, I don't think anybody would be able to sort of show Jeff Bezos in that light, simply because it seems like he's never even given a cent to anybody.
Well, he's given a few quid to his ex.
Yeah,
that's for sure. Cool. Yeah, she's not going to struggle for a while. All right, then. Cool. I think we've done an hour. On that note, speculating about Jeff Bezos' finances. And by the way, Jeff, we like you a bit. If you ever want to chuck a bit of that Amazon money at Telecoms.com, you're welcome. So yes, on that shamelessly cup in hand note, I'll call it a day there. So thank you very much for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.